So we are in 2 Kings, and of course the overall thought that we've been looking at here is the fall of the nation, because that's what everything is headed toward in both Israel and in Judah. But specifically right now we're in 2 Kings chapter 3, where we find something going on with Israel and Judah and other nations involved as well. You look at the first 5 verses of 2 Kings chapter 3, and we find the two primary actors, the two main kings that are involved in this particular chapter. And who are we talking about? The kings of who? You have King Jehoram, who's the king of Israel, and what other king do we see? King Mesha, who is the king of Moab. And so those are the two primary kings that we see involved in this chapter. And what's the big thing that's going on here? What's taking place? Moab is rebelling against Israel. And so that's the situation we find ourselves in, and the king of Israel is concerned about the situation. So verses 6 through 10 of 2 Kings chapter 3, what does the king of Israel do? Who's he go to? He goes to the king of Judah, doesn't he? First, he gathers, of course, all the people of Israel and gathers them together, musters the army. Then he goes to Israel, goes to Jerusalem, and recruits the king of Judah and all the army of Judah. And then they march from there down to where? Down to Edom. And then they get the king of Edom and, of course, the army of Edom on their side as well. So you have these three nations that have gathered together now to fight. But, of course, what's the hardship and the difficulty that they faced at the end of this? They've been going 7 days now without water. No water for themselves, no water for their animals. And of course, you think about the map that we've been showing, what type of terrain have they been going through? Desert, mountainous terrain. And so they're obviously in very dire straits at that point. But the lesson that's learned from verses 11 through 20 is that the Lord will deliver. These are the verses we looked at last time, where we saw that finally they go to Elisha, and Elisha was among them the whole time, but they hadn't even gone to and sought him out. And we saw the contrast between Jehoram and Jehoshaphat. You have King Jehoram, who when the problems arise, he gets angry with God and voices everything against God, compared to Jehoshaphat, who instead says, why don't we turn to God? And so a good contrast there for us to consider when things don't always go the way that we would have them to in our life. But the main verse that I want us to look at for just a second before we get into the new section for today, somebody go ahead and read 2 Kings chapter 3. And just go ahead and read verses 14 down through verse 20.
And Elisha said, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, surely were it not that I regard the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not look at you nor see you. But now bring me a musician. Then it happened, when the musician played, that the hand of the Lord came upon him. And he said, thus says the Lord, make this valley full of ditches, for thus says the Lord, you shall not see wind, nor shall you see rain, yet the valley shall be filled with water, so that you, your cattle, and your animals may drink. And this is a simple matter in the sight of the Lord. He will also deliver the Moabites into your hand. Also you shall attack every fortified city and every choice city, and shall cut down every good tree, and stop up every spring of water, and ruin every good piece of land with stone.
So we talked last time about what all of that entailed as far as what was required of the people, what the purpose of each of those things was, why they would attack the fortified cities and the choice cities, why they'd cut down the good trees, stop up the water, and ruin all the good pieces of land with stones, so that everything was uninhabitable and they wouldn't be able to build their forces and their strength back up. But what I want us to key in on is verse 18. We kind of quickly ran through the end of the section, but verse 18, what do we learn about this? All of these things that are going to take place are what in the sight of the Lord? They are simple. Now you read what's going to happen here and how these ditches are going to be filled with water when there has been no rain. That's not a simple thing, is it? We can't comprehend how that's even possible. But to God, It's a simple thing. And if that's a simple thing, then how much easier is it for him to deliver the Moabites into the hand of the armies? And so that's the lesson that's being taught here, is the fact that the Lord will deliver, but of course there's something that must be done on the part of the Israelites and those of Judah and those of Edom. But they went ahead and they did as they were supposed to do, having dug out all the ditches for the water there in the valley. And then verse 20, we're told that it happened in the morning when the grain offering was offered, that suddenly water came by way of Edom, and the land was filled with water. And so God delivered, and he filled those ditches with water, and you can just imagine how thankful the armies had to have been. Probably how quickly all the animals of the armies ran down to that water when it was there so they could get a drink as well. And it's evidence that God was going to deliver the Moabites into their hand, of course, so long as they would continue to be faithful and do what God said needed to be done. But that brings us then to the battle, which will take us from verse 21 to the end of the chapter. And let's have somebody go ahead and read 2 Kings chapter 3, verses 21 through 23.
And all the Moabites heard that the king had come up to fight against them. All who were able to bear arms and older were gathered, and they stood at the border. Then they rose up early in the morning, and the sun was shining on the water. And the Moabites saw the water on the other side as red as blood. And they said, "This is blood. The kings have surely struck swords and have killed one another. Now therefore Moab to the spoil."
So the Moabites, what's the situation? What do they see? What do they think? They've come and they're kind of at the border, right? So they're a little ways across from the camp of the Israelites and those of Judah and those of Edom, and they can see the camp. And what do they see? They see all these ditches filled with water, but the water is red, and they think they're looking at blood. So in their mind now, what are they thinking?
Easy pickings.
Easy pickings. I thought it was interesting anyway, looking at it in some of the history. They said that, at least in that culture, that there was a thought that anytime you had different nations come together as allies, that whenever you would see blood in the camp, that was a sign, whether it had happened or was about to happen, that those those allies had actually turned against each other, become enemies, and they'd been fighting amongst each other. So for the Moabites, they're thinking easy pickings, because in their mind, okay, the Israelites, those of Judah, and those of Edom, they've all turned on each other, and they've gotten mad and upset with each other, and guess what? They've killed each other off, and whoever's left, we can go in and finish, and we can get all the spoil for ourselves. But what they're about to find is that that's not what happened. And so let's keep looking, and let's have somebody read verses 24 and 25.
So when they came up to the camp of Israel, Israel rose up and attacked the Moabites, so that they fled before them. And they entered their land, killing the Moabites. Then they destroyed the cities, and each man threw a stone on every good piece of land and filled it. And they stopped up all the springs of water and cut down all the good trees. But they left the stones of Kir Hareseth intact. However, the slingers surrounded and attacked it.
And so we find then that when the Moabites entered the camp, they quickly had to flee the camp. This is the same map I showed the other day to show sort of some of the distance and where they'd gone from Samaria to Jerusalem down to the wilderness of Edom. And so this is where they started. They come down here. Jehoram gets Jehoshaphat on his side. Come down here to wilderness of Edom. They have the Edomites. And this is kind of where the battle roughly began. And so you can see this is where some red, if you're close enough to see it, begins. And they eventually have to come back across and find their way, basically just fighting all the way to Kir Hareseth. So Kir Hareseth was one of the capitals of the Moabites, and so it was a chief city. Now, think back to the command that was given by God through Elisha. If you want God to deliver the Moabites into your hand, what must you do? Well, you got to cut down the good fruit trees, right? You got to stop up the water springs. You're going to throw rocks and stones out on all the good land so nothing can grow up. What was the other command? you attack every chief and fortified city. What greater chief city or fortified city would there have been than a capital like Kir-Hareseth? And so the armies, as they go from the initial point of battle, everything seems right. I mean, you read the text and it talks about all these things they're doing, but what do you notice in the midst of verse 25?
They left it intact.
But they left the stones of Kir-Hareseth intact. You think there's any lesson in that for us? What stones is it that we've left intact that God's instructed for us to tear down? Are there certain things that we've been told by God that we need to put away, that we need to put to death, that we don't need to have in us? And we recognize all the things that we're not to do, and so we stop up the springs of water, and we cut down the good fruit trees, and we throw the stones on the land, and so none of those things are going to come back. But do we have something like Kir-Hareseth that we've left intact in our life? Is it something like pride? Is it something like covetousness? Is it anger? Is it some idol in our life? Right? Do we have these things that we've left intact? Now we're going to see, of course, it would have been a very simple thing for God to deliver the Moabites into their hands, but because they would leave the stones of Kir-Hareseth intact and not actually do what God said, well, God's not completely going to deliver them at this point. And so we're going to recognize the dangers then that come with not doing as God says we need to do. And so they left those stones intact. The end of verse 25 tells us how the slingers surrounded and attacked it. And so that's just a part of the army there, that they had the slings with all the stones and everything else, and they're surrounding the city, but they weren't doing exactly as they should have done. And then we'll get into those last couple of verses. Somebody read verses 26 and 27.
And when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too fierce for him, he took with him 700 men who drew swords to break through to the king of Edom, and they could not. Then he took his eldest son, who would have reigned in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering upon the wall. And there was great indignation against Israel. So they departed from him and returned to their own land.
So the battle was growing fierce for the king of Moab. Of course, when you're one against 3 nations worth of armies, that's going to be a pretty hard fight, right? It should not have been any problem for the Moabites to completely been destroyed, but the 3 armies did not do exactly as God had told them to do. So they're driven back, and the king of Moab, it says, he took the 700 men who drew swords. They were going to break through. He thought he saw opportunity to get to the king of Edom, wherever that was around the city. I don't know, but he saw opportunity to get to him, but we're told that he could not. So he couldn't break through with the 700 men to get to the king of Edom. And so what is his response in verse 27? The king of Moab does what?
Sacrifices his son.
He sacrifices his son. Now, it's possible to look at this and read it, and the first several times I was going through in my head, I was thinking, okay, this is the king of Moab taking the king of Edom's son and sacrificing him. But really what I think it is actually the king of Moab taking his own son and sacrificing his own son on the city walls. So you have this entire battle going around, and next thing you know, you see this giant altar, funeral pyre thing being built up on top of the city walls. And then the king comes out with his son, who everybody in Moab knows is going to be the next to reign. And he takes him and puts him there and sacrifices him in front of everyone. We're kind of left with that being the end. It's a weird way to end it, but it leaves us with a sense of uneasiness and discomfort, that it's not a pleasant thing to look at and to see, but that's what was being left behind in the land. And that's what was influencing the people of Israel and the people of Judah. And one of the things that I was looking at and thinking about through it is this is going all the way back to the beginning of this particular chapter. when you think about the history behind it, and I showed the picture of that Moabite stone that specifically mentioned one of the reasons why they felt like, the Moabites felt like they were in the situation they were in, was because they had angered their national god Chemosh. They had angered their false god, and so in order to try and appease the false god, that's why you have this human sacrifice going on. Now, we would think God's people would have absolutely nothing to do with this. But did you know that there were temples and altars to that very specific God right outside of Jerusalem? You go back to 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 11. First Kings chapter 11. And this is back when Solomon was king. But 1 Kings chapter 11, somebody read verses 6 and verse 7. Verse 6 through verse 8.
Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David. And Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives, to burn incense and sacrifice to their gods.
Sometimes we wonder why, maybe it's just me, I wonder why did the things happen to Israel that happened to them? Right? They're God's chosen people, His special people. And then you come to places like this, and you see that you have the leader of God's people establishing temples and altars to these abominations, as they are called. These abominations where the people who serve them think the only way to please them is to do human sacrifice. It makes more sense why they ended up falling. But we also think about God's patience and His mercy and His grace through it all. Because that was back in the days of Samuel. Now we're generations down the road. And the nations are still standing and still have opportunity to do right and to please God and to finally take care of these problems that should have been taken care of all the way back in the days of Joshua. There's a good lesson there of God's patience and mercy and grace, but eventually we'll see through the book of 2 Kings, that's going to run out. We don't need to take advantage and take advantage of those things and take it for granted in our own life. But instead, we need to learn from these lessons and simply do what God says to do. And that will save us a lot of problems down the road. I mean, you think about the situation with the Moabites. If they had just done what they should have done, then they wouldn't have been a problem for the Israelites or for the people of Judah any longer. But down the road, because they left the stones intact, because they didn't completely take care of these cities like they were supposed to, the Moabites would rise back up and be a problem for the people of God again. You go to 2 Kings 13. 2 Kings chapter 13. And somebody read verse 20.
Then Elisha died, and they buried him. And the raiding bands from Moab invaded the land in the spring of the year.
So that's interesting. They wait for Elisha to die, and then immediately what do the Moabites do? They go back into attack. Another place we can look, if we go to 2 Kings 24. 2 Kings chapter 24. And so that last one was going into Israel. Now 2 Kings 24, we're talking about Judah. 2 Kings chapter 24, somebody read verse 2.
And the Lord sent against him raiding bands of Chaldeans, bands of Syrians, bands of Moabites, and bands of the people of Ammon. He sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken to his servants, the prophets.
So among all those who came in to destroy Judah, you find the Moabites. What if they had just done what they were supposed to do? They wouldn't have been in that situation. And so that's a lesson that we can't stress enough anytime we go through, especially the Old Testament, is we've got to do what God says to do. So a couple of the takeaways that we have from this particular chapter. Sin is sin no matter the sin. We talked about that in the very beginning as it relates to Jehoshaphat. Jehoram. Jehoram was better than his father Ahab, but he still had the evil of his own that he did. And so sin is sin no matter the sin. We talked about that as we came to it. Of course, never underestimate the power of God. Filling those ditches with water to the Lord was a simple thing. Delivering the Moabites into their hand was going to be a simple thing. But there were certain things required on both ends. God was obviously going to do what he said to do. But to fill ditches with water, it implied that the people had to dig what? They had to dig ditches. In order to deliver the Moabites into their hand, what did the people have to do? All those things they were told to do. There are things that God is able to do for us in our life that seem beyond our ability to understand, and really they are. But to God, it's a simple thing. But before he does it, are there not certain things maybe that we have to do that God has said we need to do? And so we need to make sure that we do it. And then lastly, we need to tear down what God says to tear down. Don't leave those stones intact in our life, but if God says get rid of it, tear it down, demolish it, what do we need to do? Get rid of it, tear them down, and demolish it. And so those are our takeaways from 2 Kings chapter 3.
Galatians 5, that last one. Here, in the words of the flesh, we tear down, but replace it and build back with
The fruit of the Spirit. Yeah, absolutely. If you didn't hear my dad tying that last thought about tearing those things down to Galatians 5, where you have the works of the flesh, that those are the things we tear down, but then we replace it and build up in its stead the fruit of the Spirit in our life. And so that's a very good thought to bring out. So we'll move into 2 Kings chapter 4. And this is going to be a longer, overall section. You can see up here I have this running through the first part of chapter 6. And I've titled this The Prophet's Care. You go back to 2 Kings chapter 2, and what transition did we see in 2 Kings 2? From Elijah to Elisha. And at the end of 2 Kings 2, we saw Elisha beginning to show that he was just as capable as Elijah. You remember he picked up the mantle, he said, "Where's the Lord God of Elijah?" And he strikes the water, and what happened to the water? It parts. So he crosses back over the Jordan. And then he goes into Jericho, and the people of Jericho came to Elisha at the end of 2 Kings 2, and they said, "We got a problem with our water. There's barrenness among us." And so Elisha calls for a bowl of salt. He dumps it there in the source of the spring, and suddenly the water is purified to this day, it says. And then you get to the very end, and you have the situation in Bethel with the young boys, and they're saying, "Go up, bald head, go up, bald head." And what's Elisha do? He calls on God to send the she-bears out, and it mauls those boys. And so we talked about all that in chapter 2, but it was glimpses into who Elisha is, how capable he is. Well, then chapter 3, we had the little bit of a shift to look at the big picture of what's going on in the nations. Now we're going to hone back in specifically on Elisha. And we're going to notice the type of care and the type of man that Elisha was. And so let's start then verses 1 through 7, where we're going to talk about Elisha and the widow. There's going to be some interesting parallels kind of throughout this from here to chapter 6 that connect in some places to some of the things that Elijah did. And I believe that's for a reason, again, to show that Elisha and Elijah were very similar, that they're both very capable men of God. But I find it interesting how we see God's prophet, especially in this particular section, who's showing so much care to different groups of people, and especially to those who often were overlooked in their time. But 2 Kings chapter 4, let's have somebody read verse 1, where we'll see the problem of this particular section.
And a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord. And the creditor is coming to take my 2 sons to be his slave."
So what's the problem? You have a woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets, so just that school of prophets, comes to Elisha and lets him know my husband is dead, that my boy's father is dead. That's a problem. And then you add to it not just the loss of a spouse or the loss of a father, but what other problem do we find in this? We've got a lot of debt that we can't pay, and the creditors are coming, and since we can't pay it, what are they going to do? They're now going to take my boys away. So it's not just the fact that I am now a widow, but now I'm going to have to deal with the reality of suddenly having my sons taken away from me, and that's all that I have left. I don't even have anything to be able to pay back on this debt. It's a real problem. But thankfully, when she recognized the problem, to whom did she go? She goes to Elisha. Now, I understand, of course, we talk about some of these things, and we talk about, well, why doesn't she just go straight to God? But remember the nation that she's living in? I mean, this is a wicked and corrupt nation with wicked and corrupt kings for generations. She may not really understand what it takes to go to God. On top of that, maybe we say, well, why is she not going to the priests, right? The priests are the ones who would go into the temple and serve, but you go back and see what Jeroboam did in 2 Kings 12 around, or 1 Kings 12 around there, and what's Jeroboam do to the priests? Priests from every nation and tribe. So it's not just from the Levites. So it's not even true priests. So really, she's doing the best that she can possibly do in her situation, going to God's man. Geraldine?
Well, I also think that this is just a lesson for us today that God, like, we are to turn to God, but we also do have to take action and accountability in our own lives.
Right.
It's not magic. He's not just gonna give you, he's not just gonna put $1,000 in your bank account if you need it. Sometimes you're gonna have to work for it.
Yeah.
He still blesses you with that through you being able to work for it. But sometimes that's how his blessings work.
Absolutely, and that's something that's going to really shine forth as we keep looking through this section, and even in the next encounter we have with Elisha, and when you get down into verse 8 and following. But especially right here, we'll see that as we keep going through, so I'm glad that you're already picking up on that right here at the beginning. So then let's go to verses 2 through 4. Somebody read verses 2 through 4.
So Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" And she said, "Your maidservant has nothing in the house but a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go borrow vessels from everywhere, from all of your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few. And when you have come in, you shall shut the door behind you and your sons. Then pour it into all those vessels and set aside the full ones."
So what's Elisha tell her to do? Well, first, I mean, you see in verse 2, we might be kind of taken aback, and he's like, well, what do you want me to do for you? Maybe you think about Jesus in John chapter 2, when his mother comes to him, and Jesus says, well, woman, that kind of a thing. It's more of a respectful thing maybe than what it sounds like to our English ear in that particular culture. But he's asking her, okay, well, what's the situation, right? What do you have? What does this woman have? Besides herself and her 2 sons, emphasize the fact that it is one. Not jars of oil, plural, right? Our house right now, we've got like a thing of avocado oil and a thing of olive oil, and then we've got, 1 or 2 of those stocked up underneath for when we run out, right? We have jars of oil at our house. No, this woman has a jar, singular. Probably not even the size that we have in our homes, all of us today, right? We're talking about a smaller container here of oil, and that's it. So what does Elisha tell her to do? Elisha says you're going to have to work for it, right? Back to Geraldine's point, you got to be active, you got to do something here. So go to your neighbors, ask if you can borrow some of their empty containers, right? So collect all of these empty vessels, these empty jars, empty containers, and then you and your sons, so it's a team effort here, bring them back to your house. When you've got everything, all the ones that you're going to have that you're able to collect, go into your home, shut the door, and then what does he say to do? Take your 1 jar of oil and start pouring it out into the empty containers. Now, in our human physical minds, what are we going to start doing? You're kidding me right now. You really think that's going to help? You're telling me to go do all this work and all this effort to make myself look like an idiot? I mean, is that not what's going through our minds? But what's the woman going to do here? She trusts. And she's going to show great faith. Did I see your hand, Jesse Lee?
I think it's interesting to look at that not only would she just have to work hard, but she would also have to swallow her pride and almost become a beggar, which is very looked down upon. And I think that can be applicable to us, that sometimes we might not just have to work hard, but sometimes we might have to swallow our pride.
Do something uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I think about, of course, it's applied to prayer, especially when you look in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus talks about ask and it shall be given to you, seek and you will find, all those things, knock it will be opened. But I think this is a very real situation of it. If you don't go, you're never going to receive. If you don't go and ask, especially, you'll never receive. You've got to go and do these things. And what we'll see, well, I'll wait till we get there to bring this point out. But let's go ahead and look at these last couple of verses of this section of Elisha and the widow. Let's have somebody read verses 5 through 7.
So she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured it out. Now it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said to her son, Bring me another vessel. And he said to her, There is not another vessel. So the oil ceased. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, Go, sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons live on the rest.
You look at these verses here, and we find verse 5, of course, where she's done as Elisha says. So her and her sons have gathered all the empty containers they could from their neighbors, or at least whatever they felt like was necessary. So they go home, they shut the door, and what do they start doing? She takes her one jar of oil and starts pouring, and keeps 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 pouring, and she's holding it, and she says, I need another jar in front of me, and what do her boys say? We're all out. Right from one single solitary jar of oil, she's now filled all of these containers. We don't know how many, but it's evidently enough based on when she goes to Elisha that she tells him, okay, we've done what you've said to do. Notice she doesn't take matters into her own hands at this point, but she goes back where she needs to go, asks Elisha. Elisha says, okay, you sell what you need to satisfy your creditors, but guess what? You're still going to have abundance because you and your boys can live on the rest. What was it that limited the amount that this woman was able to do? The amount she collected. Maybe it involves some faith. Maybe it involves that just they had literally wiped all their neighbors out of their empty containers. But nonetheless, what if her and her boys had only gone out and collected, well, I've got 2 hands, so I'll get one. I'll get, a second for my other hand. Boys, y'all both get 2. That way, we have 1 in each hand and let's go home. And that way we don't look too stupid at the end of this. No. They had arms full. What were you going to say, Brian?
I just said they'd still be owing.
They'd still be owing, right? She wouldn't have her boys anymore. Their faith is what allowed them to get all of those jars. If they didn't have the faith, Brian recognizes exactly where they would be. How much at times maybe do we limit what God is able to do in our lives because we don't have the faith of this woman? It's a pretty humbling lesson for us. I think I saw David and then Johnny.
Elisha told her, don't gather just a few.
Mm-hmm.
Get all you can get.
Absolutely.
She needed a milk truck.
Yeah. She needed an 18-wheeler, right? Johnny?
I was going to say, this is similar to what Elijah did for the widow that he was staying with.
Mm-hmm.
He told her to use the last little bit of meal or flour that she had and the last little bit of oil and to make him a cake
Mm-hmm.
to eat. And then her flour bin never went empty and her oil never ran out.
Yep, and so there's our first connection to Elijah in this, right? That first similarity. And we'll see another similarity once we get into verses 8 and following and everything that occurs there. Did I see your hand, Benjamin?
Well, I was gonna ask you, where she got the empty vessels from, it makes me think she shared in fellowship,
Mm-hmm.
love.
Right,
Those
that,
around.
yeah, and that's a good thought there, that her neighbors appreciated her, her neighbors loved her, and, so they were willing to, give her those extra empty vessels.
And yet again, they come to the experience of having this man come forward.
Mhm.
And, well, appropriately enough,
Yeah.
just divide it.
That's a good thought there. I hadn't even thought about, is the way that really all the neighbors were able to take part in that and enjoy in the same of the results from it.
They all, as far as home training,
Mhm.
they all had the same ways of
Right.
traditionally speaking,
Yeah.
how you would prepare
Mm-hmm.
for your next meal offering or
Mm-hmm.
just live in the good graces.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great thought, Benjamin. Thank you for that. So as we finish up, because I don't think we'll be able to get into the next section, or at least cover enough of it that I'd like to, we'll just think about this question and then wrap it up. So what type of lessons might we learn? Velda, did you have something?
Well, the only thing that I was going to make a comment on is the mother's love. For she loved her sons, which gave her the initiative to stress, hey, this is what we've got to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so she just followed through, was pushed forward.
Yeah. Because she knew it's not just for her, but she's doing it for her boys. And she doesn't want her boys to be in the situation of having to be enslaved to pay off the debt, but instead that they can all continue to be together there. And especially in that culture, that was extremely, extremely important for her to continue to have her sons there with her to help care for and provide for her. So a lot of lessons that we can learn from this particular miracle. But what type of lessons maybe do y'all see that we haven't mentioned yet? What about the fact that she begins with one jar and ends up with more than enough to satisfy the creditors, but plenty to live on? Could we make the lesson from that God will take our little and bring about great abundance, right? But also, what about the fact that, as y'all recognize, the only thing that limited this is faith. God can take our small acts of faith and bring about great results from it. You think about how it is that also involved in it, to Geraldine's point earlier when we got into verse 1, is that sometimes we've got to act. We have to do something. And so right there we find the necessity of obedient faith, don't we? That it's not just trusting and believing that God can do this. And Geraldine, like you said, it's not just that suddenly you're going to have this large figure in your bank account, but you got to go do something. If you want God to provide, you have to act as He says to act. Johnny?
Don't say he told her to go and sell the oil and pay your debts. Do that first,
Mm-hmm.
and then you and your sons live on the rest. So they had to not only get square with whoever they owed, but they had to use what was left wisely.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. They had to be smart about it and be good stewards with it. Jesse Lee?
I think you can see God's lack of partiality, just in the sense that we've seen how looked down upon women in general were, I guess, in the Old Testament, but then
Mhm.
this is a widow. And Elisha, God's prophet, is helping her.
Yeah.
That's just really, I think that's a good lesson we can learn. That's really interesting.
Absolutely, and that's kind of the last one, at least I'd put down here. And I had a couple verses to go with a thought like that. If we go to Deuteronomy 10:18, Deuteronomy 10:18, and while you're turning over there, I can at least kind of mention what that is there in Deuteronomy 10, talking about God. We learn from Deuteronomy 10 and verse 18 that God administers justice for the fatherless and the widow. So Jesse Lee, right there to your point, God's taking care of them. But one of the things we find throughout the Old Testament and even the New Testament, God is one who always took care of those who maybe struggled to take care of themselves. or he took care of those that the society and community kind of cast aside, that, well, we don't really need them, they're not productive, they don't do anything to take care of the rest of us. God always cared for those who needed it the most. You go to Psalm 68. Psalm 68 and verse 5. Psalm 68 and verse 5, and what we learn about God from Psalm 68 and verse 5 is that He is a father of the fatherless, and He is a defender of the widows. Do we not see those things in action right here in 2 Kings chapter 4? We see how God takes care of the widows and the fatherless. One final passage, you can just write it in your notes, Psalm 146 verse 9. Psalm 146 and verse 9, where we find that God is the one who relieves the fatherless and the widow. And so just right there again to Jesse Lee's point. And that's a lesson for us. What can we do to help those who might be in a situation like this woman? So we'll stop there, and Lord willing, next time we'll pick up verses 8 to 37 with Elisha and the Shunammite.